Good morning, colleagues. My name is Petronila Lamunu. I work with the NGO and Human Rights Department in Total Energies E&P Uganda. Welcome to this presentation on human rights impact assessment. We listen to you, our stakeholders, and your request for more detailed information. And we are actually happy that this did not fall on deaf ears, so we implemented the Let's Talk initiative. I know somebody would wonder, what is the Let's Talk initiative? The Let's Talk initiative is actually a response to the feedback that you gave us, and to give you more detailed information in the environment, social and human rights issues. So, in addition to this, we will be issuing a bulletin which will have extensive links to reading materials that will help you to understand what we are doing as a company. This, you will find it on our website. Please create time to look at it. We have reserved a monthly slot where we'll be having these sessions, and we look forward to engaging with you and keeping up with the spirit of transparency. Just a little bit of our position in relation to human rights. Total Energies as a group has a history of respecting human rights, and it is among the first companies that actually set up a dedicated organization on human rights at the headquarter level. The company actually also involved a lot in with the UN team under John Ruggie, who drafted the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Total Energies Group is committed to respecting internationally recognized human rights standards and instruments, for instance, the voluntary principles on security and human rights. Since 2016, we have published a human rights briefing paper, which is regularly updated, and it is also available on our Total Energies website. You will find the link on a brochure that we'll be issuing immediately after this recording. With that said, I would like to invite my colleague, Mary Beg Safa. She is the NGO and Human Rights Manager, who will give us a deep dive into the Tilenga Human Rights Impact Assessment findings, its aims, the methodology that was taken, and the summary of the findings. Thank you so much, and have a great morning.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here to present the Tilenga Human Rights Impact Assessment. I'm delighted to be here because a lot of work has gone into this HRIA. Two consultants have worked on it with us. We've interviewed over 500 stakeholders. Probably many of the people watching this presentation will have been interviewed for this assessment. And we've involved many of the teams within Total E&P Uganda and within the Tilenga project. I think it's really important to remember that human rights is not just the affair of one department. It's not just because the department that Petronila and I work in is called NGO and Human Rights Coordination, that we are the only people concerned with human rights in the company or in the project. What is really important is that each of the actors within the project owns the human rights issues related to the work that they're carrying out. And so that's why we've involved so many departments and so many people in the carrying out of this impact assessment. So why a human rights impact assessment? Well, there's many reasons. And one is the heightened expectations, both nationally and internationally, in relation to sustainability. And of course, human rights is one key aspect of sustainability. So internationally, we know that the EU is currently working on new legislation on sustainable performance, including human rights. We know also that the UN are working on a draft treaty on business and human rights, and many countries have mandatory national legislation on human rights due diligence, and one of those countries is France, so that's of particular concern to TotalEnergies. We also know that lenders and investors increasingly require that projects that they invest in are sustainable, and there's a confluence of civil society advocacy in these areas. These are areas which rightly are at the forefront of the minds of many NGOs and civil society actors. And this phenomenon isn't just international, it's also national. And so we're very glad to see civil society actively engaging on business and human rights issues, challenging our company and our project on these issues. We're very happy also to see the publication of the Ugandan National Action Plan for Business and Human Rights, which was published in the autumn of this year, and to see the activity of the Ugandan Human Rights Commission. So expectations and concerns are high, but that's not the only reason that TotalEnergies is concerned about human rights issues. In fact, it's much more fundamental than that. One of the main principal actions of TotalEnergies as a sustainable company is respect for others. Respect for human rights has long been at the cornerstone of our code of conduct. So we don't just carry out human rights impact assessment or take an interest in them because of international legislation or national expectations, but also because it's a core value of our company to respect others, along with our other principles of action such as safety and maintaining operational excellence in safety, a zero tolerance to corruption and to fraud, and transparency in conducting our activities. TotalEnergies, the company, is committed to respecting human rights. We adhere to the principles set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're a member of the United Nations Global Compact Initiative. We have committed to respect the key conventions of the International Labour Organization. We commit to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and also to implement the voluntary principles on security and human rights, as Petronilla mentioned earlier. And perhaps most importantly, certainly very prevalent in our thoughts, are the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, which were endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And as Petronilla mentioned, some of our teams were in fact involved in the preparation of those guiding principles. Within TEPU, we are also committed to carrying out human rights due diligence, and the human rights impact assessment is only one part of that due diligence. In fact, we follow a due diligence process that involves assessing risks, then integrating those risks and taking action through mitigation measures, tracking those mitigation measures and communicating about the work that we're doing. And in all of that, we seek to engage constantly with stakeholders, and including you as civil society organizations. Prior human rights impact assessments have been done. In fact, there was a human rights section within the Tilinga Environmental and Social Impact Assessment, which was conducted between 2015 and 2019. And from that, many social management plans, resettlement action plans, and other processes were established. We also have conducted a VPHSR risk assessment, and as you know, ECOP also has a standalone human rights impact assessment. So this new Tilinga standalone human rights impact assessment is part of a process of continual renewal of our risk assessments and our commitments. And following on from this HRIA, we hope shortly to publish a TEPU human rights policy. We will set up a cross-functional human rights committee, and we will make sure that we implement the Human Rights Action Plan which comes out of this HRIA. So what about the process that we followed in conducting this HRIA? Well, first of all, there was a scoping and prioritisation of salient human rights issues. Then a field mission was carried out into the project area. An in-depth analysis of existing mitigation measures to verify whether those mitigation measures were enough and sufficient and appropriate to meet the risks that we had identified. Then we did heat mapping and prioritisation of the risks to come up with a finalised assessment report and action plan. So first of all, the identification of salient issues. So human rights are numerous and broad-reaching, as we all know. Some of them are on this slide. I really like this slide because it's set up as a puzzle, and very many of these human rights actually overlap. But there are so many of them that in order to carry out a real in-depth study, we need to work out which of them are the most salient and the most relevant to our project. So what is a salient issue? Well, the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework set these up, and they explain that these salient issues are those human rights that stand out because they're at risk of the most severe negative impacts through the company's activities or its business relationships, for instance, our supply chain and our contractors. And so these are the issues that we chose to focus on. And for this project, we identified three main categories of salient issues. The first relate to human rights in the workplace. They relate to our contractor and suppliers' workers' rights. And they include issues such as forced labour, child labour, making sure that the working conditions of workers are safe and that they're receiving a fair remuneration. The second pole of salient issues that we identified are those that relate to local communities, the impact that our project might have on the communities around the project. And issues that were identified in part from looking at the questions that were being raised by civil society organisations and other documents that had been produced, reports that had been produced by civil society organisations, were information and consultation, the need to make sure that people understand what we're doing and that we're communicating with those around us. The issues related to land and resettlement, project-induced in migration, road safety, and cultural rights. And then on the security side, the project works with both private security forces and also public security forces who are active in the area, and it's important to identify the risks related to security. And in addition to those, we identified three cross-cutting issues. One is gender, women's rights and gender equality. The second is the importance of access to remedy and grievance mechanisms. And the third is the issue of the rights of human rights defenders. I think it's important to say that these salient issues were identified partly through discussions with the consultants, but also by a really thorough desktop review which the consultants did before they started. So they looked at all of the reports that had been created and published, the community-based human rights impact assessments that had been carried out by NGOs, media reports and so on, because we wanted to have a view of what salient issues were, which went beyond just what our team's perception, our internal perception was. During the fieldwork study, our consultants engaged very extensively As you can see here, they spoke to over 500 stakeholders, including affected stakeholders. That column includes both project-affected peoples. It includes also civil society organisations and NGOs. Then they spoke to duty bearers, as an example, district officials, Human Rights Commission, and similar organisations, and then a number of other key stakeholders, including those involved in the management of the Murchison Falls Park, for instance, which of course is in proximity to the project. And so the most important section of this presentation, what were the main findings of the Tilinga Human Rights Assessment? What I propose to do is go through many of these findings, but perhaps not all. I think it's quite lengthy to go into all of them in detail. And so please be aware that this is a summary. That there is much more information in the Human Rights Impact Assessment itself, which will be published along with an executive summary, and I hope that will be done in the coming days and weeks. So the first issue, contractor and suppliers' workers' rights. Why was this identified as a salient issue for this Human Rights Impact Assessment? Well, it's partly due to the very large number of contractors coming into the area, along with their subcontractors and their suppliers during the construction phase. There will be many thousands of contractors coming into the area. And therefore, the project has a responsibility to exercise due diligence, not just with respect to our own personnel, which in many ways is easier to manage, but also with respect to our contractors and suppliers' personnel. And so we had existing mitigation measures in place. And in fact, we have a document which is known as the Fundamental Principles of Purchasing. And this document covers human rights, health and safety, environment, fraud and corruption, competition law, and local economic development. And these fundamental principles, every supplier or subcontractor which wants to work on the Tilinga project, or indeed on any Total Energies project worldwide, must commit to following these fundamental principles of purchasing. They're annexed to every contract, and they are the core of the company's response to this area. We carry out a pre-selection check on our contractors, and we engage with proposed contractors at tendering stage, not just on health and safety issues, but also on human rights issues. We want to make sure that before people even take part in our tendering process, that they understand the importance of these issues for our company. As I mentioned, we have contractual provisions, and they include requirements on our contractors to in turn incorporate our human rights requirements into their subcontracts. It's important to include human rights issues in onboarding and induction training of contractors, and then to make sure that when we're carrying out auditing of contractors and subcontractors, that there's a human rights element in that. And I think this is really particularly important because these issues may be new to some of the contractors that we're working in. The company has a commitment to try and support our contractors, not just to throw out a document and ask them to implement it, but actually to try and support them in helping them to understand what that actually means. So the consultants established that whilst many of the key issues to mitigate the risks in this area were already in place, that there were certain areas that they wanted to emphasize as we move forward. And therefore, they recommended in particular that we put more emphasis on really ensuring that those pre-selection, onboarding and induction mechanisms that I mentioned earlier are effectively carried out and are done in a way that is understandable to our contractors. They also implored us to verify our key contractors' policies and procedures. It's not just enough to ask them in the contracts to put these in place, but it's important also to follow up and make sure that they are being put in place and carry out a verification. They asked us to ensure that contractors put in place effective grievance mechanisms for workers. It's important to note that the Tilinga Community Grievance Mechanism is implemented both by TEPU but also by each one of our contractors. But what the consultant said is it's important also to make sure that within the contractor's staff, that where the workers have a complaint, that there's an effective grievance mechanism whereby they can raise complaints without fear of retaliation. And in fact, we have an innovative app that we're considering putting in place to give the workers a voice. It's called the Workers' Voice Initiative, and we hope to be able to roll this out in relation to the Tilinga project. The consultants also recommended that we proactively conduct inspections of working conditions, particularly with respect to high-risk contractors, and that we pay special attention to the issues of gender equality and non-discrimination. And more generally, they pointed out that by doing this work, there was an opportunity for TEPU to contribute to building capacity of Ugandan companies generally in this area. That if we create a toolbox, tools, training materials in relation to responsible procurement, that these can be used even outside the project. And they suggested that in the long term we might want to consider working with some of the universities or colleges to train procurement students in issues of responsible procurement management. Project-induced migration. Now, this is a phenomenon which is very common and related to large-scale developments of all sorts all over the world. The highest risks, typically in all sectors, relate to third parties seeking opportunities. So either speculators coming into the area looking for land, buying up land, or speculators coming in looking for jobs. And also there is a risk that as there is immigration into the areas where large-scale developments are taking place, that they may bring with them a potential criminal element. It's sometimes known as the honeypot syndrome. And so project-induced immigration can cause problems in communities next to these big large-scale developments such as oil and gas developments by increased use of roads, pressure on education with schools being oversubscribed, pressure on health services with locals no longer having sufficient access to hospitals and healthcare systems, access to water, electricity and sanitation. Then generally competition for economic resources, for contracts and for employment. This is an issue that had already been identified by the project, as I'm sure you know, because it was in the environmental and social impact assessment. And so existing mitigation measures had been put in place by the project. We are trying to seek to minimise the incentives for PIN, and also to manage the residual impacts when it does occur. One of the ways that we're doing that is through a community health, sanitation and safety management programme, which is focusing attention on potential influx hotspots. And we also have a labour management plan, again, as you know, which prioritises local hiring for non-skilled and semi-skilled jobs. This should seek to make sure that the people who live and work in the communities take priority for these jobs over anyone who may have recently come into the area. The consultants recommended that we strengthen our project-induced in migration studies. In particular, they said we should proactively monitor and validate PIM hotspots. So now that in-migration has started to occur, we should make sure that the areas that we identified way back when we were doing the environmental and social impact assessment are actually the areas that are feeling the impact of in-migration. And we should make sure that any mitigation measures that we work on, or that we work on in conjunction with the authorities, take place where influx is actually occurring. They also recommended that we establish a monitoring framework and that this be strengthened. And obviously these are issues which are not directly related to the project, but rather indirectly related, and it's so important that we work with local government, community leaders and other actors so that we can build their capacity and make sure that multi-stakeholder initiatives are taking place. So PIM is not something that is simply an issue for project developments, for Total Energies and our partners on these projects, but it's an issue generally in the region. And so we need to work with all of these other actors. Gender equality and women's rights. So there are a range of risks and impacts relating to gender equality, including impacts relating to gender-based violence and the risk of gender-based violence. This could be caused potentially by off-duty misbehaviour of contractors or security forces who have come into the area. And there's also potential for incidents of intimate partner violence that could be triggered by project activities, for instance, because of increased revenues in families in the area thanks to land compensation and also employment opportunities. International expectations are high in this area, and so we already had existing mitigation measures in place. As you probably know, we have a gender management plan which we're currently at the initial stages of starting to implement. And you probably know also that our resettlement action plans contain quite specific measures for women displaced through the resettlement process. We've made sure that compensation agreements are signed by women, that they have access to financial literacy training, and that they are fully involved in all measures related to livelihood restoration. And in fact, we've received thanks by a number of women's groups for the efforts that we've made in that regard. And our stakeholder engagement plan also contains measures on equitable participation of women in engagement processes, making sure that meetings are taking place, for instance, at times of the day where women are available because they're not working in the fields or have child care obligations. But the consultants recommended some additional recommendations. In fact, they recommended a big focus on this area, and partly due to in-migration into the area. Some of the issues that they felt that we should be very careful of is harassment or even gender-based violence in the workplace as we encourage women to come into the workplace and on site. They were concerned about potential increases in prostitution in the area and perhaps even trafficking of persons or children, and increases in sexually transmitted diseases, substance abuse, other negative health outcomes for women. They recommended that we have adequate safeguards in place for handling complaints or incidents relating to gender-based violence, and above all that we identify opportunities to work in partnership with local authorities, security forces, health centres and relevant organisations to strengthen positive gender relationships in the area, and especially to create safe spaces for women within the communities. And so we will be working with experts that can help us and raise awareness of creative initiatives and best practice in this area. One area that I think is particularly important is road safety. This was prioritised as high-risk activity because of the increase in road traffic during the construction phase, but also because the roads in the area have been improved, and as a result, vehicles are moving much more quickly on the roads than they have done traditionally. On the roads there are employees of Total Energies, but also our contractors, suppliers and other third parties. And so there must be no compromise on road safety, even when time pressures related to construction occur. And this is something that we tell our contractors over and over again. We put safety above any time pressure relating to the project. Road safety is taken very seriously by Total Energies, and so we already have measures in place to enforce speed limits on our vehicles with trackers. Vehicle compliance inspections are carried out, and driver management includes training and monitoring of our drivers, and also road risk assessments and mitigation are some of the mitigation measures put in place. But in addition to training our own people and our own drivers, we have plans for community road safety management and transport management. And it's especially important that we're looking at road safety awareness in the communities and the schools, because so many children are on the sides of the roads walking to schools and walking around the area collecting water and firewood and so on. Children are an important target for road safety awareness. It's recommended that we should reinforce these measures, particularly working with school officials, police, but also parents, to implement sensitization and mitigation measures. It's also recommended that we improve the reporting channels for complaints by the communities so that it's obvious for them where they can make complaints about unsafe driving behaviour. That we monitor driver wellness. If drivers are tired, then there's more risk of accident, and so it's therefore very important that we manage their fatigue and we make sure that they're not working long hours, driving long hours. And of course, every accident related to the project must be investigated and measures taken to not only to provide remedy, but also to ensure appropriate learnings and corrective actions. Interactions with government security forces and also private security forces. I haven't included in this presentation slides on private security forces because many of the mitigation measures are very similar to those that we have in place for government security forces, and the risks in relation to private security are less because those for private security working on the project do not have arms. They're not in possession of lethal weapons. The risks related to government security forces are a widely recognised issue worldwide. They're not particular to this project or to this country, and it's widely recognised that care should be taken when companies are working with government security forces, particularly when they're providing logistical support, vehicles, accommodation, communication systems, that great care should be taken that no action will be taken by the company that encourages intervention or inappropriate use of force. And it's very important to monitor and follow up incidents with the government security forces. And then, of course, there are potential issues of off-duty misconduct of personnel. The company is strong in this area, I think, and the project is very strong in this area because we have over the last years been continuously implementing the voluntary principles of security and human rights and carrying out trainings with the government security forces. And we've also drafted an MOU which will be signed with government security forces in the coming weeks or months. In fact, just in 2021, 123 security force members were trained and 349 private security company individuals were trained. There were 26 trainings for government security forces, so that you can see this isn't just something that's one-off, it's something that's done continuously. The consultants recommended that we ensure that MOU is signed as soon as possible because they felt it provided a clear framework for continuous engagement on VPHSR. A risk assessment had been done in the past on VPHSR, and they recommended that that be updated, and that will be done shortly. And they requested that training materials be strengthened to include some of the other issues that they had identified during the human rights impact assessment, so particularly gender-based violence, the issues of freedom of expression and the rights of human rights defenders, and then the importance of the authorities registering and responding complaints that may be made to them directly. They also insisted that we ensure that government does not deploy commanders of units who have in the past been responsible for abuses or allegations of abuses. And they requested that we work with our community liaison officers to make sure that the communities understand our security arrangements. And in fact, I think this should be the object of a future Let's Talk. Perhaps we could focus for a dedicated presentation on the project's work with private and government security forces. Cultural rights. These have been prioritized by the project, and in the short term, one of the issues that has been identified is focused on the relocation of sacred sites, making sure that that relocation is done with all due respect to the culture of the peoples concerned, and particularly the relocation of graves, making sure that that is done in the most respectful way possible. But in the longer term, as there is migration into the area, there are potential adverse impacts that may occur on other cultural rights, for instance, cattle culture or the language of ethnic groups in the area. And there's a risk that these are eroded over time. We already had mitigation measures in place through our cultural heritage and archaeological management framework, but the consultants recommended that these be strengthened. First of all, that we put emphasis on a capacity building program for our contractors and our personnel, and that we emphasize the potential human rights issues related to cultural rights. They requested that we continue to engage and consult with cultural institutions and representatives of ethnic groups to develop long-term strategies with them. It's important that we work together with the affected people, and we don't try and go off on our own. All measures must be done collaboratively. And they requested that we consider opportunities to work with partners or provide training and capacity building on a rights-based approach. Grievance mechanisms and access to remedy. There was a lot of feedback from the stakeholders to our consultants on our community grievance mechanism. And that feedback was focused on a number of issues. For instance, the speed of resolution of grievances, a request for more consistent recording and documentation of grievances, a request for more feedback before closeout. Sometimes it takes time to resolve grievances, and while these are being worked on, it's important that we get back to the complainants and provide more consistent feedback. That we strengthen the mechanisms for escalation of grievances. When we have to move to levels 2 or 3, we should be using third parties in a more consistent way to support resolution of those grievances, and generally just a concern about increased transparency and reporting of our framework. Important to note that the community grievance mechanism is not the only one that exists. There are a variety of other grievance mechanisms related to the project. Firstly, I've already mentioned that our contractors are also required to establish grievance mechanisms for the community, but also for their workers. We have an innovative mechanism, which is an app called My Safety for All, which allows people and workers in particular, to raise issues about safety performance in an anonymous way through the app. we're hoping to put in place a Tilinga road safety mechanism, which will use, again, mobile app technology, and that's being piloted to allow workers and contractors to raise issues specifically about road safety. And then we have our own TEPU employee grievance procedure and bullying and harassment policy. Our consultants insisted that we develop an updated communication strategy on the community grievance mechanism, that we emphasize the importance of the grievance mechanism with the contractors right from the start when they begin to work with us, and that we review our processes to make sure that there's appropriate safeguards against any form of retaliation, and that our staff are properly trained in handling sensitive grievances, including those relating to sexual harassment, gender-based violence, and human rights defenders issues. I've mentioned already the need to reinforce work with independent third parties, giving us assistance to help us involve really complex or sensitive grievances. And they also suggested that after an appropriate lapse of time, a participatory review should be conducted to make sure that the grievance mechanisms are focusing well, or functioning well, rather. I've come to the end of this presentation on the Tilinga Human Rights Impact Assessment, but I would just like to emphasize that the slides that I have given don't cover all the topics that were examined during the assessment. And so I would suggest that as soon as it's published, and we will send you the link, that you take a look at the executive summary and the entire impact assessment, that you examine it, and that if you have any further questions or anything that you would like to discuss with us, that you let us know. We can set up meetings with coalitions of NGOs, with NGOs directly, or private bilateral meetings, and we would be delighted to discuss any of these issues with you. If you have any questions or comments about this presentation or about the Human Rights Impact Assessment generally, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us on the email address that you can see on the screen. We would be delighted to set up meetings or to respond to you in writing. We look forward to future Let's Talk presentations and webinars with you, and we'll address to you our Let's Talk Tilinga Human Rights Impact Assessment brochure for further information and for further reading on these issues. Thank you very much.